At Consultation Dynamics, we're here to help you find your way through that maze of product introduction, product releases that is the most effective path to reaching the mind and heart of the customer. And to do so, we want to talk about the laws of marketing here. A few years back, there was a publication called The 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing. We're going to cover 22 laws here. We are going to discuss the four key elements that have to do with gaining a position of control and leadership within the marketplace. The law of leadership, the law of category, the law of the mind, and the law of perception. Let's deal with the first one, the law of leadership. Works like this. Who's the first person to fly the Atlantic solo? Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. Charles Lindbergh, correct. Did it in 1927. He flew from Roosevelt Field in New York to Le Bourget in Paris, France. Did it by himself. You know Lindbergh? He was famous. Parades, all kinds of events in history surrounding the Lindbergh name. Who was the second person to fly the Atlantic? Don't know him. Never heard of him, right? Gentleman's name was Clarence Chamberlain. Now, Chamberlain's story is probably one of the more fascinating ones. It can be said that Chamberlain did it better than Lindbergh because Chamberlain flew from Roosevelt Field and made it all the way to Berlin, a greater distance. And he had a passenger on board his plane. And before he took off from Roosevelt Field, he and the passenger did a 51-hour test flight around Roosevelt Field to prove that the plane was durable enough to make the flight. And so all these elements rolled together made sense that Chamberlain should have been the outright winner of the situation. However, something ironic happened. He became the second person to fly the Atlantic only 14 days after Lindbergh, and yet nobody knows him. The syndicate that owned the plane had a problem selecting the second person to sit in that passenger seat or that co-pilot seat, and they changed it a few times. And one of the individuals that they had taken off the list took exception to that, and so got an injunction against Chamberlain flying the Atlantic because he wanted to be on the plane. So while this plane was tied up in court, the flight was tied up in court, that's when Lindbergh made his flight. So close were these two gentlemen, Chamberlain and Lindbergh, and so close were their plans as far as the flights were concerned, that Chamberlain gave Lindbergh his weather maps because he was going to leave the day before Lindbergh actually left in his flight to Europe. And so Lindbergh used his information to make his flight. And yet nobody knows Clarence Chamberlain. The leading brand in nearly any product category is most frequently the first brand to market. And that allows that brand to make itself first into the prospect or the customer's mind. Rental cars. Hertz comes to mind. Now, curiously, Hertz was not the first. They came out a year later than the first. First company was actually one called Saunders Drive It Yourself System, and it became Avis down the road. A year after Saunders started that in 1917 and 1918, Hertz, what became Hertz, came up with a company called Rental Cars, much more direct. And they captured the market and became the leading brand in rental cars. Soft drinks, Coca-Cola. Actually, in the 1800s, late 1800s, Coca-Cola was sold and branded as a medicinal drink. Domestic beer, Budweiser. Cover that topic a little more here in a bit. Canned soup, Campbell's. One of the greatest examples of leadership and holding on to the leadership position over a period of time. Let's take a look at that. In 1895, Campbell's introduced its first jar of ready-to-eat soup on the market shelves. They'd had the product out there, but they put it on the shelf and now you could buy it. 2 years after that, they developed the process of condensing soup, putting it into a smaller package, into a can, thereby accessing more people, and the storage time was much, much greater. And so they captured an even larger share of the market, but they didn't change the original formula that was the Campbell's tomato soup product. The can doesn't look much like what we see today. However, in 1898, the can changed as a result of the executives going to a college football game and liking that red and white color on one of the team's uniforms that they saw. And so they changed it to the colors we see today. And 2 years after that, They won a bronze medal for product excellence at the Paris Exposition. The medallion that they had was then added to that red and white can and looks like the Campbell's tomato soup can we see today. It's been little changed since 1900. They've led the market and have held that leadership position ever since in condensed canned soup. The only thing that they've really changed on there is the size of the can. It's now a little over 10 ounces as opposed to being 12 ounces. But everything else about it has been the same for over 100 years. The law of category helps you modify the law of leadership when you're coming out with a new product. And the example here is, who's the third person to fly across the Atlantic? You didn't know the second, so you'd think, how could you possibly know the third? But you do. It was Amelia Earhart. She was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic. Did it in 1927, but she did it as a passenger, curiously enough. When launching a new product, don't ask, how is this product better? That's not what will get you into the right category. Ask instead, in what category is this product the first? Recategorize the market that you're going to so that you can be first in a new category, because everyone is interested in what's new. Few people will proclaim or admit interest in what's better. To admit interest in what's better means you have to shut down what you were thinking before about what was better and admit you were wrong. Talk a little bit more about that when we get into the discussion of the law of the mind and perception. A lot of category really comes into play when we start looking at beers, for example. Late 1800s until the mid-50s, Schlitz was the #1 beer brand in America. Around that time in the mid-50s, they were trying to produce more beer quicker, and they developed a process called accelerated batch fermentation. Now, this is factual. You can look it up on the Schlitz website. They'll tell you historically they feel that this was the key thing that brought the downfall of the company. Because what it did was it allowed their competition to say that they were selling green beer. They publicized that they had made this process to develop the beer faster, and so in everybody's mind in the market, they were making an inferior product. Of course, their competitors helped them to feel that way about it. By 1957, Budweiser had taken over that #1 position as far as beer in America and has held it ever since. And curiously, Budweiser has never based its marketing plan on the quality or taste of the beer. It based it on Americana. Anheuser-Busch purchased the St. Louis Cardinals. Baseball, America's game, America's team, America's game. And all of their advertising and promotion relates to the feel-good of families, of communities, the pastoral view of the United States, Middle America and such. That's the image that Budweiser has projected, not the taste of the beer and not the beer itself, thereby locking people into a feel-good feeling about their brand. Law of category extends even further when we look at other brands on the market. For example, Heineken was the first import beer to America after World War II and has held that position ever since. No one's even come close to them. Light beer by Miller was the first light beer marketed as light beer. Fewer calories, a lower alcohol content, so you could drink more beer over the weekend while you're having fun. Remember the ads? Taste great, less filling, with all the weekend jocks up there proclaiming how great it was to be drinking light beer. Curiously, light beer had a hammerlock on that position and then surrendered it. They didn't want to pursue that weekend jock image anymore, so they started marketing the product to an upscale, quote-unquote, yuppie market, who, by the way, doesn't drink anywhere near as much beer as the weekend jocks do, and they lost their leadership position to Bud Light, who walked right into that same market clientele that light beer had abandoned, and they've been #1 in light beer ever since. The last great recategorizing that's taken place is by the Boston Beer Company, focused on the Sam Adams label. Today they have over 60 brands of beer out there, or 60 labels that they have, because they're branding themselves a microbrewery. They started in 1984. By 88, they had 7 million in sales, and in 2020, just under 2 billion in sales, by capturing segments of the market in all kinds of different categories. The schooling here is You don't have to go after the number one position to be the number one position. You recategorize the entire market into smaller categories and take over the number one position in those categories. And so in the law of marketing, or law of category, when we look at it, the key is Heineken, number one import, light beer, then Bud Light, the number one light beer, Sam Adams, the leading microbrewery, all targeted categories of the total market, not just the top position. Law of the mind. As we discussed earlier, it modifies the law of leadership to this extent. Being first to market is good only if you tell people you're first to market. It allows you to be first in the mind of the customer, but if you don't take advantage of that, it's all for naught. The single most wasteful thing you can do in marketing is to try and change a mind. And the reason for this is that in the mind, people develop perceptions, and the perceptions are interpreted as universal truths. People are seldom ever wrong in their own minds. If you think that's the case, try arguing with them about religion or politics and see how stout they are on those areas. Now, here's a key thought to keep in mind here. We're going to talk about mind and perception here. Perceptions are important because every person has perceptions about products that they buy and that they use. Facts about those products are not as important as perceptions in the way the mind works. It's not that they're not important intrinsically, but in the way the mind works in individuals, perception is the key element that you want to focus on. The law of perception tells us this: there are no best products, there are no facts, there is no objective reality. What exists are perceptions. Perception becomes the reality because that's on an individual basis. A little bit more on that in a moment. When we look at the reason most products fail in the marketplace, it's because companies assume that they're fighting a product battle that's rooted in reality and not a product battle that's perception. Curious thing happened a number of years ago. McDonald's had a quarter pounder on the market. That was their big push as a big change in their own product brand. A&W, who had their own hamburger stand, started to market a hamburger that was a third-pound hamburger. Now, think of the numbers, 1/4 versus 1/3. We do the math, a third-pound burger is more than a quarter-pound burger. But 3 is smaller than 4, and the perception was that the A&W product that was put into all of their fast food chains was less product than the McDonald's quarter pounder. Perceptions are interpreted as universal truths. Reality is fact, reality is truth. But the problem here is that reality is not always a known factor in the mind of individuals. And while reality is a fixed factor, perception of reality is variable from person to person. Think of your company costs and selling prices. Is the lowest price off the shelf really the best deal? Perception-wise, people may think that, but it might not be the real truth. 72% of people say in studies that reputation of a brand impacts their buying decision more than costs. Over 60% of consumers will research online now that they have the ability to do so in a very simple fashion. Before, they used to look up in magazines or articles and try and find it that way. Today, it's much easier to do on the internet, and they'll do that before making their buying decision. Nearly half of those are reading online reviews and opinions, and 80% of the consumers will reverse their decision based on those reviews and opinions they read online, but all of these are elements of perception. The reputation of a company, the online reviews, etc., those are all perceived qualities of a company. They're not facts. How clients view you is everything, and consistency is the key, such as with Campbell's soup. It's got to taste the same, looks the same. When you buy it off the shelf, you're going to get the same thing that you got when you were a kid. The law of perception and the law of the mind work together, and they're a strong, powerful tie to holding people to buying brands that they're familiar with and that they see every day and that they've become comfortable with. So law of marketing, why is it important? Because brand failures stem from the failure to connect a positive customer perception with the company, either its product, its service, or innovation, and it leads a company to have to focus on pricing strategies only. Those erode profits, commoditize markets, and there's no future in that type of marketing approach. Brand successes, on the other hand, create a high value perception in the mind of the customer, and that high value perception of a product or a company equals customer loyalty. And loyalty, buying over and over and over again from a particular company, is what allows the company to invest in brand innovations that increase company profits and allow them to grow, expand, and control the marketplace that they're in. The laws of marketing. At Consultation Dynamics, we're here to guide you through the laws of marketing to increase profits and grow your company.